My name is Captain Ezra Thorne, and I'm an airline pilot who survived the first 72 hours of the zombie outbreak. What started as a routine layover in Denver became a nightmare when contaminated water turned people into flesh-eating monsters and the power grid failed nationwide. I had to make impossible decisions to keep other survivors alive while using my aviation training to navigate through a city of the undead. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Captain Ezra Thorne, and I'm an airline pilot who survived the first 72 hours of the zombie outbreak. What started as a routine layover in Denver became a nightmare when contaminated water turned people into flesh-eating monsters and the power grid failed nationwide. I had to make impossible decisions to keep other survivors alive while using my aviation training to navigate through a city of the undead. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. I've been flying for Delta Airlines for the past 18 years, accumulating over 15,000 flight hours across commercial and military aircraft. My colleagues called me Blackbird because I had a reputation for navigating through weather conditions that would ground other pilots. I'd flown through Category 4 hurricanes, landed planes during ice storms, and successfully completed emergency landings that should have been impossible. But nothing in my training prepared me for what happened on October 12, 2024. That morning started like any other. I was scheduled to pilot Flight 1247 from Seattle to Atlanta, a red-eye departure that would get me into Georgia by sunrise. The weather forecast showed clear skies along our entire route, which should have been my first warning that something was wrong. In aviation, when everything looks perfect, that's usually when disaster strikes. I performed my standard pre-flight inspection, checking every system twice because that's what keeps passengers alive at 30,000 feet. The first sign of trouble came during passenger boarding. I noticed an unusual number of travelers looked sick. Not the typical tired business traveler sick, but genuinely ill, pale faces, sweating despite the cool October air, and several passengers complained about stomach cramps. Our flight attendant, Jessica, mentioned that at least a dozen people had asked for water before we even pushed back from the gate. They all described the same thing, a metallic taste in their mouths that wouldn't go away. During my career, I'd learned to pay attention to patterns. In aviation, small anomalies often indicate bigger problems. When multiple passengers report similar symptoms, it's worth investigating. I called the gate agent to check if there had been any issues with the airport's water supply. She told me everything was normal, but I could hear uncertainty in her voice. Airport personnel had been dealing with more sick passengers than usual over the past 48 hours. We pushed back from Seattle at 11:30 p.m., exactly on schedule. The takeoff was smooth and we reached our cruising altitude without incident. But about 2 hours into the flight, things started getting strange. Passengers were becoming increasingly agitated, and several were vomiting despite the calm conditions. I've seen air sickness before, but this was different. People were sweating profusely and complaining about severe headaches. Some passengers were acting irrationally, snapping at flight attendants over minor requests. Jessica came to the cockpit around 1:30 in the morning looking concerned. She told me that passengers were drinking water at an alarming rate, but nothing seemed to satisfy their thirst. Several travelers had become so aggressive that she was worried about maintaining order in the cabin. I made the decision to contact air traffic control about potentially diverting to Denver International Airport. My instincts told me something was seriously wrong, and in aviation, you always trust your instincts. Air traffic control cleared us for an emergency diversion to Denver. As we began our descent, I noticed something unusual in the radio chatter. Multiple aircraft were reporting similar passenger disturbances, and several flights had already diverted to various airports across the country. Controllers sounded more stressed than usual, and there were gaps in communication that didn't make sense. Normally, air traffic control maintains constant contact with all aircraft, but we were hearing long periods of silence. The approach to Denver International Airport was routine, but I could see unusual activity on the ground. More emergency vehicles than normal were positioned around the terminal, and there seemed to be commotion in the passenger areas. visible through the terminal windows. I completed the landing checklist and touched down smoothly on runway 34 right at 2:47 a.m. Ground control directed us to a remote gate, which was odd for a passenger aircraft, but I followed their instructions. During taxi to the gate, I observed ground crew members who appeared to be moving erratically. Some were stumbling, others were gesturing wildly, and a few seemed to be arguing with each other. In my years of flying, I'd never seen airport personnel behave so chaotically. Ground crews are typically the most professional and organized people in aviation, so this immediately raised red flags. I made a mental note to report these observations to airport security once we deplaned. Passenger deplaning took longer than usual because several travelers were too sick to walk unassisted. Airport medical personnel met us at the gate, but they seemed overwhelmed and understaffed. I noticed that the medical team members looked exhausted and stressed, like they'd been dealing with similar situations all night. Before leaving the aircraft, I asked Jessica to document everything she'd observed during the flight. Something told me this information might be important later. The terminal was chaos. Passengers from multiple flights were exhibiting similar symptoms, and airport security was struggling to maintain order. I've seen delayed flights and frustrated travelers before, but this was different. People weren't just angry about travel delays. They were acting irrationally aggressive. Several passengers were being restrained by security personnel, and I could hear shouting and arguments throughout the concourse. The metallic taste complaints were universal among affected passengers. I checked into the downtown Marriott around 4 a.m, planning to rest before my connecting flight to Phoenix later that day. The hotel staff seemed unusually irritable and pale, which I initially attributed to the late hour and stress of dealing with stranded airline passengers. The front desk clerk kept rubbing her temples and wincing as if she had a severe headache. She mentioned that the hotel had been unusually busy with diverted travelers, and many guests were complaining about feeling sick. My room was on the 15th floor with a view of downtown Denver. Before settling in, I tried calling my sister, Maya, who works as a park ranger in Yellowstone National Park. Maya has always been the outdoor survival expert in our family, with extensive wilderness training and emergency response experience. I wanted to tell her about the strange flight and get her perspective on what might be causing these widespread symptoms. Her phone went straight to voicemail, which wasn't unusual given the remote location of her work, but something felt off. I attempted to review the news on my phone, but internet connectivity was spotty. The few articles I could access mentioned isolated incidents of food poisoning and water contamination in several major cities, but nothing that explained the scope of what I'd witnessed. Local Denver news was reporting increased emergency room visits, but they were attributing it to seasonal flu. My pilot training taught me to gather information from multiple sources before drawing conclusions, so I turned on the television to see if there was additional coverage. The local news channels were showing confusing and contradictory reports. Some stations mentioned possible water contamination affecting several western states, while others were focusing on what they called isolated incidents of public disturbance. I noticed that news anchors looked tired and stressed, and several reports were cut short or interrupted by technical difficulties. This lack of clear information made me increasingly uncomfortable, especially given what I'd observed during the flight and at the airport. Around 6 a.m, I decided to get some rest before my afternoon departure. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept thinking about the patterns I'd observed: the sick passengers, the metallic taste complaints, the aggressive behavior, and the apparent spread across multiple cities. My military background had taught me to recognize signs of systematic problems, and everything I'd seen suggested something much larger than isolated incidents of food poisoning. I was awakened around 10 a.m. by commotion in the hallway. Other hotel guests were talking loudly about feeling sick, and I could hear someone vomiting in a nearby room. I opened my door to find Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman from the room across the hall, leaning against the wall and looking extremely pale. She was sweating despite the cool hotel temperature and complained about severe stomach cramps. When I asked if she needed medical attention, she became irrationally angry and accused me of trying to harm her. Mrs. Chen's behavior was disturbing because it matched what I'd observed on the aircraft. The same progression of symptoms: metallic taste, excessive thirst, severe headaches, and then aggressive, irrational behavior. I helped her back to her room and suggested she contact hotel management for medical assistance. She reluctantly agreed, but continued to eye me suspiciously as if I posed some kind of threat. Her reaction was completely disproportionate to my offer of help. I went downstairs to the hotel lobby around 11 a.m. to check on my afternoon flight status. The scene in the lobby was concerning. Multiple guests were complaining about feeling sick, and hotel staff members looked overwhelmed and exhausted. The front desk was handling numerous complaints about water taste, and several guests were demanding to be moved to different rooms. I approached the front desk to inquire about the situation, and was told that they were experiencing unusually high numbers of guest complaints, but management was investigating. While waiting in the lobby, I noticed a small television in the corner showing a news report about water system issues in several major cities. The reporter mentioned that municipal water supplies in Denver, Phoenix, and Seattle were being tested for contamination, but results wouldn't be available for several days. This information immediately connected to my observations from the flight. Passengers from Seattle had been exhibiting symptoms, and now Denver residents were reporting similar problems. I decided to call Delta Airlines to check on my connecting flight to Phoenix. The customer service representative sounded stressed and told me that multiple flights were being delayed or canceled due to what they called crew availability issues. She couldn't provide specific details but mentioned that many airline personnel were calling in sick across several Western airports. This was unprecedented in my experience. Airlines have extensive backup systems for crew scheduling, so widespread sick calls suggested something systematic was happening. Around noon, I attempted to call Maya again, but her phone was still going straight to voicemail. I tried the Yellowstone National Park main number, but couldn't get through. The phone lines seemed to be experiencing heavy traffic or technical difficulties. I made a mental note to keep trying to reach her because her wilderness survival expertise might be valuable if this situation continued to deteriorate. Maya had always been better at handling crisis situations than anyone else in our family. I went back to my room to monitor news coverage and try to piece together what was happening. From my hotel window, I could see downtown Denver, and I noticed increased police and emergency vehicle activity on the streets below. There seemed to be more sirens than usual, and I could see crowds gathering in certain areas of the city. Through my pilot training, I'd learned to observe and assess situations from an elevated perspective, and what I was seeing suggested growing civil unrest. The television news was becoming increasingly fragmented and confusing. Some channels were still reporting routine news, while others were showing emergency broadcasts about water contamination and public health advisories. I noticed that several news anchors appeared to be struggling with their own symptoms, occasionally pausing mid-sentence or looking disoriented. The lack of consistent information was troubling, because it suggested that even news organizations were being affected by whatever was happening. Around 2 in the afternoon, I received a call from Delta Airlines informing me that my flight to Phoenix had been canceled due to crew availability. The representative couldn't provide an alternative booking and suggested I call back in 24 hours when they might have more information. This was extremely unusual because airlines typically have extensive contingency plans for crew scheduling issues. The cancellation suggested that the situation was more serious than what was being reported in the news. I decided to venture out of the hotel to get a better understanding of what was happening in Denver. The streets were busier than normal for a weekday afternoon, but the activity seemed chaotic rather than purposeful. I observed several people stumbling or walking erratically, and there were more emergency vehicles than I'd ever seen in a city center. Police officers looked stressed and overwhelmed, and I noticed they were wearing protective equipment that wasn't typical for routine patrol duties. At a nearby convenience store, I witnessed something that made my blood run cold. A customer was arguing with the cashier about the taste of bottled water, becoming increasingly agitated and aggressive. The man's behavior escalated rapidly from complaints to threats, and when the cashier tried to calm him down, the customer lunged across the counter and bit the young woman's arm. Other customers screamed and fled the store while the attacker continued his assault. I immediately called 911, but the line was busy. This incident confirmed my worst fears about the progression of symptoms I'd been observing. The pattern was clear: metallic taste, excessive thirst, headaches, aggressive behavior, and then violence. Whatever was in the water supply was causing people to lose their rational thinking and become dangerously aggressive. I realized that everyone who had consumed contaminated water, including myself, was potentially at risk of developing the same symptoms. I returned to the hotel immediately and began taking inventory of bottled water and food supplies available in my room. My aviation training had taught me to prepare for emergency situations, and this clearly qualified as an emergency. I rationed the bottled water I had and avoided using any tap water for drinking or brushing teeth. If the contamination was in the municipal water supply, then avoiding additional exposure was critical for maintaining my mental clarity. The hotel lobby was in chaos when I returned. Several guests were exhibiting advanced symptoms of aggression and irrationality, and hotel security was struggling to maintain order. I witnessed Mrs. Chen attacking a maintenance worker who had come to fix her air conditioning. She bit him on the neck, and when other guests tried to help, she turned on them as well. The maintenance worker collapsed within minutes, and I realized that whatever was happening was spreading through direct contact, not just water contamination. I immediately went to my room and began barricading the door with furniture. My military training kicked in, and I started thinking strategically about survival rather than hoping for rescue. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and it was clear that normal emergency services were being overwhelmed. I needed to prepare for the possibility that I might be on my own for an extended period. From my hotel window, I could see that the chaos was spreading throughout the city. As evening approached, the sounds from the street became more disturbing. Sirens were constant, but they seemed to be moving randomly rather than responding to specific incidents. I could hear screaming and shouting from multiple directions, and occasionally I witnessed people running through the streets as if fleeing from something. The streetlights were flickering intermittently, suggesting that even basic infrastructure was beginning to fail under the strain of whatever was happening. Around 8 o'clock that evening, the power went out completely. Not just in the hotel, but across the entire downtown area as far as I could see. This wasn't a routine power outage because there was no indication of electrical maintenance or weather-related damage. The systematic failure of the power grid suggested that the crisis had reached critical infrastructure. I used my phone's flashlight to navigate my room and began preparing for an extended period without electricity. The emergency lighting in the hotel corridors was working, but I could hear increasing commotion from other floors. Doors were slamming, people were shouting, and there were sounds of conflict that suggested the aggressive behavior was spreading among hotel guests. I realized that my room might not remain safe for much longer, and I needed to develop a plan for getting out of the building if the situation continued to deteriorate. From my window, I could see a small airfield in the distance, maybe 10 miles, east of downtown Denver. There appeared to be aircraft parked there, and I began wondering if any of them might be functional. My pilot training and aircraft maintenance experience meant that I might be able to get a plane operational if I could reach the airfield safely. This became my backup plan if staying in the hotel became impossible. I tried using my phone to gather more information, but cellular service was increasingly unreliable. The few text messages I could send weren't being delivered, and voice calls were failing to connect. I managed to pick up some radio broadcasts on my phone's FM receiver, but the information was fragmented and often contradictory. Some stations were still playing regular programming, while others were broadcasting emergency alerts about civil unrest and water contamination. The most disturbing radio broadcast I heard was from an emergency management official who was advising people to avoid contact with anyone exhibiting aggressive behavior and to seek shelter immediately. The official mentioned that law enforcement and medical personnel were being overwhelmed, and that federal assistance was being requested. This confirmed that the situation was not isolated to Denver, but was affecting a much larger area than I had initially realized. As the night progressed, the sounds from the hotel became more intense and frightening. I could hear people pounding on doors, shouting incoherently, and what sounded like physical altercations in the hallways. The emergency lighting began failing on various floors, and I realized that the hotel's backup power systems weren't designed to operate for extended periods. I needed to make a decision about whether to stay barricaded in my room or attempt to find other survivors who might be thinking rationally about the situation. Around 11 o'clock, I heard voices in the hallway that sounded different from the aggressive shouting I'd been hearing all evening. These voices were calm and purposeful, as if people were trying to organize or coordinate with each other. I listened carefully and heard someone mention gathering supplies and finding a safe place to wait for help. I realized that there might be other hotel guests who were still thinking clearly and hadn't been affected by whatever was causing the aggressive behavior. I made the decision to carefully open my door and try to make contact with these rational voices. My military training had taught me that survival often depends on working with others, and isolation rarely leads to long-term success in crisis situations. I needed to find out if there were other people in the hotel who could help assess the situation and develop a survival plan. But I also knew that I needed to be extremely careful because distinguishing between rational and irrational people was becoming increasingly difficult. I opened my door slowly and peered into the hallway. The emergency lighting was dim, but I could see several people gathered near the elevators, speaking in hushed tones. They appeared to be calm and organized, unlike the chaotic behavior I'd observed from other hotel guests. I made the decision to approach them, but I kept my room key ready in case I needed to retreat quickly. This was the moment when I realized that my survival might depend on my ability to work with complete strangers in an impossible situation. The group near the elevators consisted of 6 people, and I could immediately tell they weren't exhibiting the aggressive symptoms I'd witnessed throughout the hotel. They were speaking quietly and rationally, which gave me hope that I wasn't the only person still thinking clearly about our situation. I approached them slowly, keeping my hands visible and speaking in a calm voice to avoid startling anyone. In crisis situations, first impressions can determine whether someone sees you as an ally or a threat. I introduced myself as Captain Ezra Thorne and explained that I was a commercial airline pilot who had been stranded in Denver due to flight cancellations. The group welcomed me cautiously, and I learned their names and backgrounds. David was Taisi, a young father traveling with his 8-year-old daughter Emma. Sandra worked as an emergency room nurse at a hospital in Chicago. Jim was a hotel security guard who had been on duty when the chaos started. Margaret was a retired teacher from Minneapolis, and Robert worked in IT for a tech company in California. David immediately caught my attention because he was clearly prioritizing his daughter's safety above everything else. Emma stayed close to her father and seemed remarkably calm for a child in such a frightening situation. I could see that David was struggling with the responsibility of protecting his daughter while trying to understand what was happening around us. As a pilot, I understood that kind of pressure because every passenger on my aircraft depends on my decisions for their survival. Sandra's medical background made her invaluable for understanding the symptoms we'd all observed. She explained that the progression from metallic taste to aggressive behavior suggested some kind of neurological contamination, possibly affecting brain chemistry. She had treated patients with similar symptoms in the emergency room, but never on this scale. Sandra theorized that whatever was in the water supply was causing rapid deterioration of higher brain functions while leaving basic motor skills intact. Jim provided crucial information about what had been happening throughout the hotel. As security, he had access to surveillance cameras and communication systems that gave him a broader perspective on the situation. He told us that the aggressive behavior had started on the lower floors and was spreading upward through the building. Hotel staff members had been among the first affected, which explained why there was no organized response to the crisis. Margaret surprised me with her practical approach to the situation. Despite being in her 70s, she had maintained her composure and was thinking strategically about survival. She had been rationing her bottled water and had observed the same patterns of behavior that I had noticed. Margaret's teaching background made her skilled at analyzing information and drawing logical conclusions, which would be essential for group decision-making. Robert's technical expertise became immediately apparent when he showed us his laptop, which was still receiving intermittent internet connectivity through the hotel's Wi-Fi system. He had been monitoring news reports and social media posts from across the country, and the information he'd gathered was deeply disturbing. Similar outbreaks of aggressive behavior were being reported in Seattle, Phoenix, Los Angeles, and at least a dozen other major cities. I shared my observations from the flight and my theory about water contamination being the primary cause of the symptoms. The group listened carefully as I described the progression I'd witnessed. Passengers complaining about metallic taste, excessive thirst, headaches, and then increasingly aggressive behavior. Sandra confirmed that this matched what she had observed in hotel guests, and Jim added that hotel staff had exhibited the same pattern before becoming violent. We established our first group protocol: avoid all tap water and ration bottled water carefully. I applied the same resource management principles I used for fuel planning during long flights. We inventoried all available water and food supplies among the group and calculated how long we could survive if we remained barricaded in the hotel. The mathematics were sobering. We had maybe 3 days of water if we were extremely careful. With rationing, David asked the question that everyone was thinking: what was happening to people after they became aggressive? Jim provided the disturbing answer based on his security camera observations. The affected individuals weren't just becoming violent, they were losing all rational thinking and seemed to be driven by some kind of predatory instinct. They were attacking anyone they encountered, and the attacks were resulting in more people becoming affected within hours. Sandra's medical training helped her explain what we were probably witnessing. She believed the contamination was causing some kind of rapid neurological deterioration that eliminated higher brain functions while leaving basic motor skills and aggressive instincts intact. The infected individuals weren't thinking or reasoning. They were simply responding to primitive drives. This explained why they seemed to be attracted to noise and movement. I realized that our situation was far more serious than any emergency I'd encountered during my aviation career. In aircraft emergencies, there are established procedures and protocols for almost every conceivable situation. But this crisis had no manual, no established procedures, and no clear chain of command. We were essentially test pilots in an unknown situation, and we would have to develop our own procedures as we went along. Margaret suggested that we establish a communication system for the group, and I immediately thought of crew resource management, principles from aviation. In the cockpit, every crew member has specific responsibilities and communication protocols that ensure critical information is shared effectively. I propose that we adapt these principles for our survival situation, with each person taking responsibility for specific aspects of our group management. Jim became our intelligence officer, responsible for monitoring the situation throughout the hotel using his security access. Sandra would handle medical issues and help us understand the symptoms and progression of the contamination. David would focus on logistics and resource management, skills he'd developed in his work. Margaret would serve as our strategist, helping us analyze information and make group decisions. Robert would maintain our technological capabilities and gather external information. My role naturally became group coordinator, applying the same leadership principles I used as an aircraft captain. In aviation, the captain has ultimate responsibility for crew safety, but effective leadership requires input from all crew members. I established protocols for group decision-making that balanced democratic input with the need for quick decisions in emergency situations. Everyone's voice would be heard, but someone needed to make final decisions when time was critical. We decided to establish our base of operations in a hotel conference room on the 14th floor that had multiple exits and could be easily defended. Jim used his security access to unlock the room, and we began moving essential supplies from our individual rooms. I applied the same systematic approach to supply management that I used for aircraft weight and balance calculations. Every item we carried had to serve multiple purposes and contribute to our overall survival capability. The conference room had large windows that provided excellent visibility of the surrounding area, which would be crucial for monitoring external threats and opportunities. From this vantage point, I could see the small airfield I'd noticed earlier, and I began developing a more detailed escape plan based on my aviation knowledge. The airfield appeared to have several small aircraft, and if any of them were functional, it could provide our best opportunity for getting out of Denver safely. Robert's internet monitoring revealed that the situation was deteriorating rapidly in cities across the western United States. Federal emergency management agencies were being overwhelmed, and military units were being deployed to major population centers. But the reports were fragmented and contradictory. suggesting that even government agencies didn't fully understand what they were dealing with. This information confirmed that we couldn't rely on external rescue and needed to develop our own survival plan. Sandra made a disturbing observation about the timeline of symptom progression. Based on her medical experience and what she'd observed in the hotel, people were becoming aggressive within 24 to 48 hours of exposure to contaminated water. Since we had all potentially been exposed through hotel tap water, we needed to monitor each other carefully for early symptoms. The group agreed to establish regular symptom checks and protocols for dealing with anyone who showed signs of deterioration. David raised the difficult question of what we would do if one of our group members became affected. As a father, he was particularly concerned about protecting Emma from any potential threat, even if it came from within our own group. I drew on my experience with aviation medical emergencies, where crew members sometimes become incapacitated and must be managed. For the safety of all passengers, we established protocols for isolation and, if necessary, exclusion from the group. Jim's security camera monitoring provided increasingly disturbing information about the situation throughout the hotel. The aggressive individuals were becoming more coordinated in their movements, almost as if they were hunting in packs. They seemed to be attracted to areas where they heard voices or movement, which meant our conference room location might not remain safe for long. We needed to plan for the possibility of moving to a more secure location or evacuating the building entirely. I shared my observation about the distant airfield and my preliminary assessment of using aircraft for evacuation. The group was initially skeptical about this plan, but I explained that my aviation training included aircraft maintenance and operation of various aircraft types. If we could reach the airfield and find a functional aircraft, I could potentially fly us to a safer location. This became our primary escape strategy, though we recognized the significant challenges involved. Margaret's strategic thinking led her to question where we would go if we did manage to escape Denver. I mentioned my sister Maya, who worked as a park ranger in Yellowstone National Park and had extensive wilderness survival training. Yellowstone's remote location and Maya's expertise could provide the safety and resources we needed for long-term survival. The group agreed that heading toward less populated areas made sense, given that the contamination seemed to be concentrated in major cities. Robert discovered through his internet monitoring that several survival groups were forming and sharing information through social media platforms. He found references to safe zones being established in rural areas and mountain regions, which supported our theory about avoiding population centers. However, the information was unverified and could potentially be misinformation designed to lure people into dangerous situations. We agreed to treat external information with skepticism and rely primarily on our own observations and analysis. Sandra's medical expertise became crucial when David mentioned that Emma had been complaining about a headache. We immediately implemented our symptom monitoring protocols, but Sandra determined that Emma's symptoms were likely due to stress and dehydration rather than contamination. However, this incident highlighted how quickly our group dynamics could change if anyone showed signs of being affected by whatever was causing the aggressive behavior. The hotel's emergency power systems began failing intermittently, leaving us in darkness for extended periods. I used my aviation experience with instrument flying to help the group navigate in low light conditions and maintain situational awareness when visibility was limited. We established protocols for movement and communication during power failures, applying the same systematic approaches used in aircraft emergency procedures. Jim reported that the aggressive individuals were becoming more active during the dark periods, possibly because they were less disoriented when visual cues were limited. This suggested that they were operating on basic sensory inputs rather than complex visual processing. We adjusted our activity patterns to minimize noise and movement during power outages, effectively hiding from potential threats while conserving our energy and resources. David asked about the long-term sustainability of our situation, and I had to provide an honest assessment based on our resource calculations. Our bottled water would last maybe 3 more days, and our food supplies were sufficient for about a week if we maintained strict rationing. This timeline meant we needed to make a decision about evacuation within the next 24 hours, before our physical condition deteriorated due to dehydration and malnutrition. Margaret raised the psychological aspects of our situation, noting that stress and fear could impair our decision-making abilities just as much as physical deprivation. She suggested that we establish regular group discussions to address concerns and maintain morale. I supported this approach because aviation psychology training had taught me that crew coordination breaks down rapidly when stress levels become too high. Keeping everyone mentally sharp was essential for survival. Robert's monitoring revealed that communication systems were failing in multiple cities, suggesting that the crisis was affecting critical infrastructure beyond just power grids. Cell towers were going offline, internet connectivity was becoming sporadic, and even emergency radio broadcasts were being interrupted. This information reinforced our conclusion that we couldn't rely on external assistance and needed to be completely self-sufficient. Sandra made a crucial observation about the behavior patterns of the affected individuals. They seemed to be most active during certain periods and less active during others, suggesting some kind of cyclical pattern. If we could identify these patterns, we might be able to time our movements to avoid encounters with aggressive individuals. This intelligence could be vital for planning our evacuation from the hotel to the airfield. I began developing detailed contingency plans for our evacuation, applying the same risk assessment and mitigation strategies used in aviation emergency planning. We identified multiple routes from the hotel to the airfield, backup plans if our primary route was blocked, and procedures for dealing with various threats we might encounter. Every member of the group had specific responsibilities and backup roles in case someone became incapacitated. David expressed concern about exposing Emma to the dangers of evacuation, but I explained that staying in the hotel was becoming increasingly dangerous as our resources diminished and the number of aggressive individuals increased. In aviation, sometimes the safest option is to continue flying rather than attempting to land in deteriorating conditions. Our current situation required the same kind of calculated risk-taking. Jim's security monitoring revealed that the aggressive individuals were beginning to organize their movements in ways that suggested some kind of pack behavior. They weren't just randomly wandering through the hotel, they were systematically searching floors and rooms. This development made our conference room location much more vulnerable and added urgency to our evacuation planning. Sandra identified additional symptoms to monitor in our group, including increased irritability, difficulty concentrating, and changes in sleep patterns. She explained that these could be early indicators of neurological effects from the contamination, even if we hadn't consumed significant amounts of contaminated water. The group agreed to implement hourly symptom checks and established clear protocols for anyone who showed signs of deterioration. Robert discovered that some radio stations were still broadcasting emergency instructions, but the advice was contradictory and often seemed outdated. Some broadcasts advised people to remain in their homes while others suggested evacuating to designated safety zones. The lack of consistent guidance reinforced our decision to rely on our own analysis and planning, rather than waiting for official instructions that might never come. Margaret's strategic analysis led her to conclude that our window for safe evacuation was closing rapidly. The longer we waited, the more dangerous the streets would become and the more depleted our physical resources would be. She recommended that we finalize our evacuation plan and execute it within the next 12 hours, before conditions deteriorated further. I agreed with Margaret's assessment and began final preparations for our evacuation to the airfield. Aviation training had taught me that successful emergency procedures require thorough preparation, followed by decisive execution. We had gathered the intelligence we needed, developed our plans, and established our protocols. The next phase would test everything we had learned about survival and teamwork in the most dangerous environment any of us had ever faced. The deteriorating situation in our hotel conference room forced us to accelerate our evacuation timeline. Jim's security monitoring revealed that the aggressive individuals had systematically searched through most of the lower floors and were now moving upward through the building. Their movements were becoming more coordinated, and they seemed to be drawn to areas where they detected human activity. Our 14th floor location was no longer the safe haven we had hoped it would be. Sandra's medical observations were becoming increasingly concerning. She noticed that some members of our group were showing subtle signs of stress-related symptoms that could be mistaken for early contamination effects. David was becoming more irritable when discussing plans that involved risk to Emma, and Robert was having difficulty concentrating on his internet monitoring tasks. Margaret seemed to be handling the stress better than the rest of us, but even she was showing signs of fatigue that could impair her strategic thinking abilities. I made the decision to implement crew resource management protocols more strictly, assigning specific tasks to each group member and establishing clear communication procedures. In aviation, stress can cause even experienced pilots to make fatal errors, so we use systematic approaches to maintain performance under pressure. David would be responsible for Emma's safety and our supply management. Sandra would monitor everyone's physical and psychological condition. Jim would provide security intelligence and tactical guidance. Margaret would continue strategic planning and group coordination. Robert would maintain our technological capabilities and external communication. My role as group leader required me to make the kind of life and death decisions that I had trained for as a military pilot, but hoped I would never have to face. The weight of responsibility for 6 other lives, including an 8-year-old child, was similar to what I experienced as an aircraft captain, but the stakes were much higher because there were no established emergency procedures for our situation. We were essentially writing the manual as we went along. The hotel's infrastructure was failing more rapidly than we had anticipated. Power outages were becoming longer and more frequent, and Jim reported that the hotel's backup systems were being overwhelmed by the chaos throughout the building. Emergency lighting was failing on multiple floors, and the elevator systems had been shut down completely. This meant that any movement through the building would have to be accomplished using stairwells, which presented significant tactical challenges if we encountered aggressive individuals. Robert's internet monitoring provided disturbing updates about the situation in cities across the western United States. Military units were being deployed to major population centers, but the reports suggested that even organized military responses were being overwhelmed by the scale of the crisis. Federal emergency management agencies were establishing quarantine zones around affected cities, which meant that escape routes might be limited if we delayed our evacuation much longer. I began detailed planning for our route from the hotel to the airfield, using the same systematic approach I employed for flight planning. The distance was approximately 10 miles through urban and suburban terrain, with multiple potential obstacles and threats along the way. I identified 3 primary routes and 2 backup alternatives, each with different risk profiles and resource requirements. The group would need to travel light, but carry sufficient supplies for emergency situations. David raised the critical question of whether 8-year-old Emma could handle the physical demands of a 10-mile journey through potentially dangerous territory. I drew on my experience with passenger evacuation procedures, where we sometimes have to move people who aren't physically capable of normal movement under emergency conditions. Emma was young and healthy, but she would need special consideration and protection throughout the journey. David would carry her if necessary, and we would adjust our pace to accommodate her limitations. Sandra provided medical guidance for our evacuation planning, identifying potential health risks and first aid requirements for the journey. She was particularly concerned about dehydration and exhaustion, since our water supplies were limited and we would be traveling during daylight, when temperatures would be highest. Sandra prepared a medical kit with supplies from the hotel's first aid stations and established protocols for dealing with injuries or medical emergencies during our evacuation. Jim's tactical expertise became crucial for planning our movement through the city. His security background gave him knowledge of urban navigation and threat assessment that complemented my aviation and military experience. We developed movement protocols based on military patrol procedures, with designated roles for navigation, security, and logistics. Jim would serve as our point man, identifying threats and obstacles ahead of our route. Margaret's strategic thinking led her to question our assumptions about the airfield being our best escape option. She pointed out that we were making plans based on limited information and assumptions about aircraft availability and functionality. I acknowledged her concerns, but explained that my aviation expertise gave me the best chance of assessing and operating available aircraft. The airfield represented our highest probability of successful evacuation, even though it involved significant risks. The group faced a difficult psychological challenge as we prepared to leave the relative safety of our conference room for the unknown dangers of the city. In aviation, we call this the transition from a known emergency to an unknown emergency, and it requires mental preparation as much as physical preparation. I led the group through a mental rehearsal of our evacuation plan, similar to the emergency briefings we conduct with airline passengers before takeoff. Robert discovered through his internet monitoring that other survivor groups were attempting similar evacuations from Denver, with mixed results. Some groups had successfully reached rural areas and established temporary safe zones, while others had encountered organized resistance from infected individuals who seemed to be coordinating their attacks. This information confirmed that the aggressive individuals were becoming more dangerous and sophisticated in their behavior patterns. Sandra made a disturbing observation about the progression of symptoms in affected individuals based on her monitoring of hotel security cameras. The people who had been infected longest were showing signs of physical deterioration, but they were also demonstrating improved coordination and what appeared to be basic problem-solving abilities. This suggested that whatever was affecting their brains wasn't simply destroying cognitive function, but was changing how their minds processed information and made decisions. I began final preparations for our evacuation, applying the same pre-flight checklist mentality that I used for aircraft operations. Every member of the group had specific equipment and responsibilities, and we conducted systematic checks to ensure everyone was prepared for the journey ahead. Emma would carry a small backpack with emergency supplies appropriate for her age and size. David would carry the bulk of our water and food supplies. Sandra would manage our medical equipment. Jim would handle security equipment and tools. Margaret would carry backup supplies and serve as our communications coordinator. Robert would manage our technological equipment and navigation tools. The group made the difficult decision about what personal items to leave behind, applying the same weight and balance considerations that govern aircraft loading. Every pound we carried would slow us down and increase our fatigue, but certain items were essential for our survival and potential rescue operations. I kept my pilot's license, aviation charts, and aircraft maintenance manuals because they would be crucial if we reached the airfield. Each person was limited to one small bag of personal items beyond their assigned survival equipment. David struggled with the emotional aspects of potentially putting Emma in danger by leaving the hotel, but I explained that staying was becoming more dangerous than evacuating. In aviation, we sometimes have to make decisions that seem counterintuitive, but are based on statistical risk analysis rather than emotional comfort. The hotel was no longer sustainable as a safe location, and our resources were depleting rapidly. Evacuation represented our best chance for long-term survival, even though it involved immediate risks. Jim's final security assessment revealed that our evacuation window was closing rapidly. The aggressive individuals had reached the upper floors of the hotel and were systematically searching rooms and common areas. Their search pattern suggested they were looking for something specific, possibly survivors or resources. We had maybe 6 hours before they reached our floor, and we needed to be gone before they discovered our conference room location. Sandra conducted final medical checks on all group members and declared everyone fit for evacuation, though she noted that stress levels were high and everyone was showing signs of sleep deprivation. She distributed energy supplements and electrolyte packets to help maintain our physical performance during the journey. Sandra also established medical protocols for the evacuation, including procedures for dealing with injuries or exhaustion during our movement through the city. Margaret provided our final strategic briefing, reviewing our objectives, routes, contingency plans, and decision-making protocols. She emphasized the importance of group discipline and communication, noting that successful evacuation would require everyone to follow established procedures even under extreme stress. Margaret also addressed the psychological aspects of our journey, preparing everyone for the difficult sights and situations we might encounter in the city. Robert conducted final checks of our technological equipment and confirmed that his laptop and phone were still receiving intermittent internet connectivity. He had downloaded offline maps and GPS coordinates for our route to the airfield, and he had backup battery power for essential electronic equipment. Robert also established communication protocols for staying in contact with external information sources if possible during our evacuation. I gave the group our final briefing using the same systematic approach I employed for airline passenger safety briefings. Everyone needed to understand their individual responsibilities, group procedures, and emergency protocols. We reviewed hand signals for silent communication, established code words for different types of threats, and confirmed that everyone understood our rally points and contingency plans if we became separated during the evacuation. The moment came when we had to leave the security of our conference room and begin our journey into the unknown dangers of Denver's streets. I opened the door carefully and conducted a preliminary reconnaissance of the hallway, applying the same systematic observation techniques I used for aircraft pre-flight inspections. The hallway was clear, but I could hear disturbing activities from other floors that suggested the aggressive individuals were still active throughout the building. We moved through the hotel using tactical movement procedures that Jim had taught us, with designated spacing and communication protocols to minimize our visibility and noise signature. Emma stayed close to David, and everyone maintained the discipline we had practiced during our preparation. The hotel's emergency lighting was functioning intermittently, creating challenging visibility conditions that required careful navigation and constant awareness of our surroundings. Our first major obstacle came when we reached the hotel's main stairwell and discovered that several floors were occupied by aggressive individuals who had barricaded themselves into defensive positions. These weren't random attacks, but organized activities that suggested the infected individuals were developing survival strategies and territorial behaviors. We had to use our backup route through a service stairwell that was darker and more confined, but provided better concealment. The service stairwell presented its own challenges, including emergency alarms that had been triggered by earlier disturbances and were creating noise that could attract unwanted attention. I used my knowledge of building systems to disable the alarms without triggering additional security responses, but the process required precious time that increased our exposure to potential threats. Emma handled the stress better than I had expected, following instructions precisely and maintaining the quiet discipline that was essential for our safety. We reached the hotel's ground floor and encountered our first direct confrontation with infected individuals who had taken control of the main lobby area. These people were exhibiting the advanced symptoms that Sandra had described, with coordinated behavior and what appeared to be basic tactical thinking. They had established barriers and seemed to be guarding access points to the building, suggesting they understood strategic positioning and resource control. Jim's security expertise proved invaluable as we navigated around the lobby defenders using maintenance corridors and service areas that most people wouldn't know existed. However, our alternate route brought us through the hotel's kitchen and storage areas, where we encountered additional infected individuals who seemed to be hoarding food and water supplies. This behavior indicated that they retained some understanding of basic survival needs, even though their higher cognitive functions appeared to be compromised. David carried Emma through the most dangerous sections of our hotel exit, and she maintained perfect discipline throughout the encounter. Her calm behavior under extreme stress reminded me of passengers who follow crew instructions precisely during aircraft emergencies, and I realized that children sometimes handle crisis situations better than adults because they haven't developed the complex fears and anxieties that can impair adult decision-making. We successfully exited the hotel through a service entrance that connected to the building's parking garage, but we immediately encountered a new challenge. The streets of Denver were not the orderly urban environment we had expected. Abandoned vehicles were blocking many roadways. Emergency services were either absent or overwhelmed, and there were clear signs that organized authority had broken down throughout the city. The 10-mile journey to the airfield would be far more difficult than our initial planning had anticipated. Sandra conducted a quick medical check of the group after our hotel evacuation and found that everyone was handling the physical stress well, though adrenaline levels were high and would need to be managed carefully to prevent exhaustion. She redistributed our medical supplies and reminded everyone about the importance of staying hydrated and maintaining energy levels during the extended journey ahead. Emma was showing remarkable resilience, but David was displaying protective stress that could impair his decision-making if the situation became more dangerous. Margaret reviewed our route planning based on the current street conditions and identified several modifications that would be necessary to reach the airfield safely. The direct route we had originally planned was blocked by abandoned vehicles and what appeared to be organized groups of infected individuals who were controlling key intersections. We would need to use a longer route through residential areas, which would add distance and time to our journey, but might provide better concealment and fewer encounters with large groups of threats. Robert's technological monitoring revealed that cellular and internet service in Denver was becoming increasingly unreliable, but he was still receiving fragmentary information about conditions in other parts of the city. Military units were apparently establishing checkpoints and quarantine zones, but the locations were changing rapidly, and the information was too unreliable to use for navigation planning. We would need to rely on our own observations and tactical judgment rather than external guidance. The reality of our situation became clear as we prepared to leave the hotel's parking garage and enter the streets of Denver. We were 6 adults and 1 child, with limited supplies and weapons, attempting to traverse 10 miles of urban terrain controlled by an unknown number of infected individuals who were becoming increasingly organized and dangerous. Our success would depend on applying everything we had learned about teamwork, tactical movement, and survival psychology during our time in the hotel. I gave the group our final instructions before we left the garage, emphasizing that our survival depended on maintaining discipline, following established procedures, and supporting each other through whatever challenges we would face during our journey to the airfield. The next phase of our survival would test every skill we had developed and every decision we had made during our preparation. We were committed to our course of action, and there would be no opportunity to return to the safety of our hotel conference room. Our journey through Denver's streets revealed the true scope of the catastrophe that had engulfed the city. The organized urban environment I had observed from my hotel window had collapsed into chaos, with abandoned vehicles creating maze-like obstacles throughout major roadways. Emergency services were either completely absent or operating in isolated pockets that we couldn't safely approach. The infected individuals we encountered were exhibiting increasingly sophisticated behavior patterns that suggested they were adapting to their changed circumstances and developing survival strategies. Jim's tactical expertise proved essential as we navigated through residential neighborhoods that provided better concealment than main thoroughfares. His security background taught him to read urban terrain for potential threats and opportunities, skills that complemented my aviation training in navigation and situational awareness. We moved in single-file formation with designated spacing, using hand signals and predetermined rally points that allowed us to maintain group cohesion while minimizing our visibility to potential threats. David's protective instincts regarding Emma created both advantages and challenges for our group movement. His constant vigilance ensured that she remained safe and followed our tactical procedures, but his heightened stress levels occasionally led to overly cautious decisions that slowed our progress. I had to balance his parental concerns with the tactical necessity of maintaining our timeline to reach the airfield before our physical resources became depleted. Emma continued to demonstrate remarkable resilience and discipline, following instructions precisely and adapting to our movement requirements better than some adults might have managed. Sandra's medical expertise became crucial when we encountered other survivor groups during our journey through the city. Some of these groups included individuals who were showing early symptoms of contamination, but hadn't yet progressed to aggressive behavior. Sandra was able to assess their condition and provide guidance about whether they represented potential allies or threats. Her ability to distinguish between stress-related symptoms and actual contamination effects helped us make informed decisions about interaction with other survivors. Our first major tactical challenge came when we reached a residential area where infected individuals had established what appeared to be territorial boundaries around specific houses and blocks. These weren't random attacks or wandering threats, but organized defensive positions that suggested the infected population was developing social structures and resource management strategies. We had to modify our route significantly to avoid these controlled areas, adding distance and time to our journey while consuming precious energy reserves. Margaret's strategic thinking proved invaluable when we encountered a group of 20 survivors who were attempting to organize a convoy evacuation using civilian vehicles. Her analysis of their plan revealed fundamental flaws in their route. selection and resource management that would likely result in disaster. We made the difficult decision not to join their convoy, despite the apparent safety of larger numbers, because their approach was tactically unsound and would probably attract dangerous attention from infected groups. Robert's technological capabilities provided crucial intelligence about conditions ahead of our route, though cellular and internet connectivity continued to deteriorate throughout the city. He was able to access traffic cameras and emergency service communications that gave us real-time information about street conditions and potential threats. However, the electronic infrastructure was failing rapidly, and we couldn't rely on technological solutions for navigation or communication much longer. The physical demands of our 10-mile journey began affecting the group's performance after we had covered approximately 4 miles. Sandra monitored everyone's condition carefully and implemented rest and hydration protocols to maintain our capabilities. Emma was handling the physical stress remarkably well, but David was showing signs of exhaustion from carrying extra equipment and maintaining constant vigilance for threats to his daughter. I had to redistribute some of our load to ensure that everyone could complete the journey without becoming a liability to group survival. Our encounter with a military checkpoint provided both hope and frustration as we learned about the larger government response to the crisis. The soldiers we spoke with confirmed that similar outbreaks were occurring across multiple states and that federal agencies were implementing quarantine procedures around major population centers. However, they couldn't provide assistance with our evacuation to the airfield because their orders restricted them to maintaining their current position and processing refugees through official channels that would have separated our group. Jim's assessment of the military checkpoint revealed that the soldiers were operating under extreme stress and were showing signs of the same symptoms we had observed in early-stage infected individuals. Their behavior was becoming increasingly rigid and aggressive, though they maintained discipline and followed their orders. This observation suggested that the contamination was affecting even organized military units, which had serious implications for the long-term government response to the crisis. Sandra made a disturbing discovery when she examined some of the refugees being processed at the military checkpoint. Several individuals who appeared healthy were actually showing subtle signs of neurological effects that indicated they had been exposed to contamination, but hadn't yet progressed to aggressive behavior. The military personnel weren't screening for these early symptoms, which meant that infected individuals were being processed into refugee camps where they could spread the contamination to other survivors. The reality of our situation became more pressing as we observed the systematic breakdown of organized authority throughout Denver. Police stations were either abandoned or barricaded, fire departments weren't responding to emergency calls, and even military units were operating with limited resources and unclear objectives. Our decision to rely on self-sufficient evacuation, rather than waiting for official rescue, was proving to be correct, though the challenges were greater than we had anticipated. Margaret's strategic analysis led her to conclude that our airfield destination might be compromised by the same problems affecting other infrastructure throughout the city. She raised valid concerns about whether we would find functional aircraft and whether the airfield would be safe for extended operations. I acknowledged her concerns but explained that my aviation expertise gave me the best chance of assessing aircraft condition and operational possibilities, even if the facilities were damaged or partially controlled by infected individuals. Our group faced a moral dilemma when we encountered a family with young children who were attempting to escape Denver using an obviously inadequate plan. Their route would take them through areas we knew were controlled by organized groups of infected individuals, and their supplies were insufficient for more than 24 hours. David wanted to help them, particularly because of their children, but I had to make the difficult decision that we couldn't take responsibility for additional people without compromising our own survival chances. Robert's monitoring of emergency radio communications revealed that several other pilot survivors were attempting similar evacuations using small aircraft from various airfields around Denver. Some had been successful in reaching rural areas, while others had encountered resistance from infected individuals who seemed to understand the strategic importance of controlling transportation facilities. This information confirmed that our airfield approach was viable, but also indicated that we might face organized opposition when we arrived. The psychological stress of our journey was affecting everyone differently, with some group members becoming more focused under pressure, while others showed signs of decision-making impairment. I implemented crew resource management techniques to maintain group cohesion and performance, ensuring that everyone's input was considered while maintaining clear command authority for critical decisions. The same principles that keep airline crews functioning effectively during emergencies were essential for our survival as a ground-based team. Sandra identified symptoms of dehydration and heat exhaustion in several group members as we entered the final phase of our journey to the airfield. Denver's elevation and climate created additional physiological challenges that we hadn't fully anticipated during our planning. She implemented medical countermeasures and modified our movement schedule to accommodate the physical limitations that were beginning to affect our performance. Emma was actually handling the physical stress better than some adults, but David's protective stress was beginning to impair his judgment. Jim's tactical assessment of the airfield approach revealed both opportunities and significant challenges for our final objective. The facility appeared to be partially abandoned, with some aircraft visible on the tarmac and hangars that might contain additional resources. However, there were also signs of activity that suggested either survivor groups or infected individuals had established some kind of presence at the airfield. We would need to conduct careful reconnaissance before committing to entering the facility. Our final approach to the airfield required us to cross open terrain that provided little concealment, but offered good visibility of potential threats. I used my aviation knowledge of airport layouts and operations to identify the most tactically sound approach route, taking advantage of aircraft parking areas and maintenance facilities that would provide cover and concealment during our advance. The group would need to move quickly and precisely to minimize our exposure during this vulnerable phase of the operation. Margaret raised the critical question of what we would do if the airfield didn't provide the escape opportunity we were hoping for. I explained that my assessment of available aircraft would determine our options, but we needed contingency plans for alternative escape routes or defensive positions if the aviation option wasn't viable. The airfield represented our best chance for rapid evacuation from the Denver area, but it wasn't our only option if circumstances required different approaches. Robert's final technological assessment before we reached the airfield confirmed that communication systems throughout Denver were failing rapidly, and we would soon be operating without external information sources. His equipment was running low on battery power, and cellular towers were going offline systematically. We would need to rely entirely on our own observations and decision-making capabilities for the remainder of our evacuation operation. David struggled with the emotional reality that our journey was entering its most dangerous phase, just as his physical and psychological resources were becoming depleted. His responsibility for Emma's safety was creating stress that could impair his performance during the critical airfield operation. I had to provide reassurance while maintaining realistic expectations about the challenges we would face during our final approach to potential escape. Sandra conducted final medical preparations for our airfield assault, distributing energy supplements and establishing trauma care protocols for potential injuries during the operation. She was particularly concerned about maintaining everyone's cognitive function during what would likely be the most complex and dangerous phase of our evacuation. The group's physical condition was marginal but adequate for the tasks ahead, assuming we could complete our objectives quickly and efficiently. The airfield came into view as we crested a small hill approximately 1 mile from the facility's perimeter fence. Through my aviation experience, I could immediately assess the layout and identify potential aircraft that might be suitable for our evacuation. There were several small single-engine aircraft visible on the tarmac, including what appeared to be a Cessna 172 that could potentially carry our entire group if weight and balance calculations worked out favorably. However, our reconnaissance also revealed that the airfield was not abandoned as we had hoped. There were signs of recent activity around the main terminal building, and I could see movement that suggested either survivors or infected individuals had established some kind of presence at the facility. Jim's tactical assessment confirmed that we would need to approach carefully and be prepared for potential conflict during our aircraft acquisition and departure operations. The group prepared for what we all understood would be the decisive phase of our 72-hour survival ordeal. Everything we had learned about teamwork, tactical movement, and crisis decision-making would be tested during our final push to escape Denver. I gave everyone their final instructions, emphasizing that our success would depend on executing our plan precisely while remaining flexible enough to adapt to whatever challenges we encountered at the airfield. The next few hours would determine whether our systematic approach to survival had prepared us adequately for the ultimate test of our capabilities and resolve. Our final approach to the airfield required the same systematic precision I used for instrument landings in challenging weather conditions. Jim and I conducted detailed reconnaissance from multiple positions around the facility's perimeter, identifying potential threats, escape routes, and the condition of available aircraft. The Cessna 172 I had spotted during our initial observation appeared to be in good condition, but we would need to get much closer to assess its airworthiness and fuel status. The facility's chain-link perimeter fence was intact in most areas, providing some security but also creating obstacles for our approach and potential escape routes if circumstances required rapid evacuation. The airfield showed clear signs of recent activity, but determining whether the occupants were survivors or infected individuals required careful observation of behavior patterns. Through my aviation experience, I knew that airports attract people during emergencies because they represent escape and mobility, but they also become targets for those seeking to control transportation resources. We observed several individuals moving around the terminal building and aircraft parking areas, but their movement seemed purposeful rather than the random aggression we had witnessed from infected populations throughout Denver. Jim's tactical assessment revealed that whoever was controlling the airfield had established defensive positions around key buildings and aircraft parking areas. These weren't the chaotic barricades we had seen infected individuals create, but organized security measures that suggested military or law enforcement training. The positioning of their defensive elements indicated they understood strategic control of transportation assets and were prepared to defend against organized attacks rather than just random threats. Sandra's medical assessment of our group revealed that everyone was approaching the limits of their physical and psychological endurance. Our 10-mile journey through Denver had depleted our energy reserves and elevated stress levels to points where decision-making capabilities could become impaired. She distributed the last of our energy supplements and reminded everyone about the importance of maintaining focus during the critical aircraft acquisition phase of our operation. Emma was showing remarkable resilience, but David's protective stress was creating visible tension that could affect his performance during complex tactical operations. David's protective stress regarding Emma had reached levels that were beginning to affect his tactical judgment. His constant vigilance was essential for her safety, but his overprotective responses were causing him to question necessary risks that were part of our evacuation plan. I had to balance his parental instincts with the tactical requirements of our mission, ensuring that Emma remained safe while not allowing his fears to compromise our entire group's survival chances. His emotional state was understandable, but potentially dangerous in situations requiring split-second decisions. Margaret's strategic analysis of our airfield approach identified several concerning factors that we hadn't fully considered during our initial planning. The facility's location made it visible from multiple directions, which meant that our activities would be observable by anyone in the surrounding area. If infected groups were monitoring transportation facilities, our aircraft departure could attract unwanted attention that might threaten other survivors or compromise future escape attempts by others. The tactical implications of operating in such an exposed environment required careful consideration of timing and operational security. Robert's technological equipment was finally failing as battery power became exhausted, and communication systems throughout Denver continued their systematic breakdown. His final monitoring attempts revealed fragmentary radio communications suggesting that military units were establishing larger perimeter zones around major cities, but the information was too unreliable to affect our immediate tactical decisions. We were now operating with only our direct observations and collective expertise, which actually simplified our decision-making process by eliminating potentially contradictory external information. Jim's security assessment revealed that the airfield occupants appeared to be maintaining some kind of organized presence rather than exhibiting the chaotic behavior we had observed from infected individuals. Their movements suggested coordination and purpose, which could indicate either a well-organized survivor group or infected individuals who had developed more sophisticated behavioral patterns. We would need to approach carefully and be prepared for either diplomatic contact or tactical conflict, depending on their intentions and capabilities. Our approach strategy utilized aircraft parking areas and maintenance buildings to provide concealment during our advance toward the Cessna 172. I used my knowledge of airport operations to identify safe movement corridors that would minimize our exposure while allowing rapid access to the aircraft if circumstances required quick evacuation. The group understood that this phase would require perfect coordination and instant response to changing tactical situations, applying everything we had learned about teamwork during our hotel survival experience. The aircraft ramp area provided good concealment opportunities with multiple hangars and maintenance buildings that could serve as cover during our approach. However, the open areas between buildings created exposure zones where we would be vulnerable to observation or attack if hostile forces controlled the facility. I planned our movement using the same systematic approach I employed for aircraft taxi operations, identifying checkpoints and decision points that would allow us to assess conditions before committing to exposed movements. The first direct contact with airfield occupants came when we encountered two individuals conducting what appeared to be security patrols around the aircraft parking area. Their behavior was alert and organized, but they weren't exhibiting the aggressive symptoms we had learned to associate with infected populations. Jim made the tactical decision to initiate contact from a concealed position, using verbal communication to assess their intentions before revealing our full group presence. The initial exchange was tense but professional, suggesting we were dealing with rational survivors rather than infected individuals. These individuals turned out to be survivors from a private aviation company who had been using the airfield as a staging area for evacuation flights to rural locations. Their leader was a flight instructor named Sarah, who'd been coordinating rescue operations for small groups of survivors, using her knowledge of regional airports and aircraft operations. Her aviation expertise provided valuable information about aircraft condition and fuel availability, but she also warned us about infected groups that had been attacking airfields and transportation facilities throughout the region with increasing frequency and organization. Sarah's group had successfully evacuated over 40 people during the past 24 hours, using multiple aircraft and coordinated flight operations to reach safe zones in mountainous areas where infected populations were less concentrated. Her experience confirmed our strategic assessment about rural areas being safer than urban centers, and her operational knowledge provided crucial information about navigation and landing options for our own escape flight. She had established communication networks with other pilot survivors and knew which airports were still operational and safe for landing operations. However, Sarah also delivered disturbing news about the progression of the crisis beyond Denver. Her radio communications with other pilots revealed that infected populations were exhibiting increasingly coordinated behavior, including organized attacks on infrastructure and transportation facilities. Some groups had apparently learned to disable aircraft and vehicles to prevent survivor evacuations, suggesting that their cognitive capabilities were evolving rather than simply deteriorating. This intelligence changed our understanding of the threat and required modifications to our escape planning. The coordination between infected groups was becoming sophisticated enough to suggest some kind of collective intelligence or communication system that allowed them to share tactical information. Sarah had witnessed attacks where infected individuals used tools and basic strategy to disable aircraft engines and fuel systems, indicating that they retained enough cognitive function to understand the strategic importance of controlling transportation assets. This development made our evacuation more urgent and more dangerous than we had originally anticipated. Sarah's group had also observed that infected populations were establishing territorial control over larger areas, creating zones where survival became increasingly difficult for uninfected individuals. These territories were expanding outward from major population centers, suggesting that we had a limited window for escape before rural areas became compromised as well. The implications for long-term survival were sobering, as it appeared that simply reaching rural areas might not provide permanent safety from the expanding infected populations. The aircraft assessment revealed both good and challenging news for our evacuation prospects. The Cessna 172 was mechanically sound and had sufficient fuel for a flight of several hundred miles, which would be adequate to reach rural areas where we could establish temporary safety. However, the aircraft was designed for 4 passengers, and our group included 7 people. Weight and balance calculations would be critical, and we would need to minimize our equipment load to achieve safe flight operations while still carrying essential survival supplies. I conducted a thorough pre-flight inspection of the Cessna, applying the same systematic procedures I used for commercial aircraft operations. All flight control surfaces were functional, engine oil levels were adequate, and the fuel tanks contained enough aviation gasoline for our planned route to rural Wyoming. However, the aircraft's electrical system showed signs of intermittent problems that could affect radio communications and navigation equipment during flight. The mechanical condition was acceptable for our emergency evacuation, but would require careful monitoring during operation. The pre-flight inspection also revealed that the aircraft had been modified with additional fuel tanks that extended its range significantly beyond standard specifications. This modification would allow us to reach more distant destinations and provide greater flexibility in our escape route planning. However, the additional fuel weight would further complicate our weight and balance calculations and require even more precise loading procedures to maintain safe flight characteristics. Sandra faced a heartbreaking decision when she discovered a bite wound on her arm that she had been concealing since our encounter with infected individuals during the hotel evacuation. Her medical training told her that she was already showing early symptoms of neurological effects, including increased irritability and difficulty concentrating. She understood that remaining with the group would potentially endanger everyone else, particularly Emma, and that her condition would likely deteriorate rapidly during the next few hours. Sandra's medical knowledge allowed her to recognize the early stages of the neurological deterioration we had observed in other infected individuals. She was experiencing mild confusion, increased aggression, and changes in sensory perception that indicated the contamination was affecting her brain chemistry. Her professional integrity prevented her from concealing these symptoms when they could endanger the group, even though revealing them meant accepting her own death sentence. David struggled with the moral complexity of Sandra's situation, wanting to help someone who had been essential to our group's survival, while protecting his daughter from potential threat. His emotional response was understandable, but I had to apply the same decision-making principles I used during aircraft emergencies, where individual passenger needs must be balanced against overall safety requirements. Sandra's condition meant that she could become dangerous to the group within hours, and her medical expertise made her aware of the inevitable progression of her symptoms. The group dynamics became extremely strained as we grappled with Sandra's revelation and its implications for our evacuation planning. Margaret's strategic thinking led her to support Sandra's exclusion from the flight, while Robert struggled with the emotional aspects of abandoning someone who had contributed so much to our survival. Jim understood the tactical necessity but was clearly affected by the moral weight of the decision. Emma didn't fully understand the situation, but David's stress was affecting her emotional state. Sandra made the ultimate sacrifice by choosing to remain at the airfield rather than risk infecting our group during the flight to safety. Her decision was based on medical knowledge about the progression of symptoms and her understanding of the risks she would pose to everyone else, particularly Emma. She asked me to take her medical supplies and use her expertise to keep everyone else healthy during whatever challenges lay ahead. Her final contribution was providing detailed instructions about recognizing and treating various medical conditions we might encounter during our survival efforts. Margaret's strategic assessment of our departure timing revealed that we had a narrow window for safe evacuation before infected groups in the area might be attracted by aircraft engine noise. Sarah's group had observed that takeoff and landing operations drew attention from infected populations within a radius of several miles, and coordinated attacks on airfields typically occurred within hours of detected aviation activity. This intelligence required us to balance thorough preparation with the need for rapid departure once we committed to the evacuation. The weight and balance calculations for our overloaded Cessna required careful consideration of passenger placement and equipment distribution. I used my aircraft performance knowledge to determine that we could safely carry 6 passengers plus minimal equipment if everyone was positioned precisely, and we used short-field takeoff procedures. Emma's small size was actually advantageous for weight calculations, and David's protective positioning would help maintain proper center of gravity while ensuring her safety during flight operations. Robert's final contribution to our survival came when he provided GPS coordinates for potential landing sites in rural Wyoming, where other survivor groups had established temporary communities. His offline mapping data included information about private airstrips and emergency landing areas that wouldn't be monitored by either military units or infected populations. This navigation information would be crucial for finding safe destinations. Once we became airborne, as traditional navigation aids were no longer reliable, Jim's tactical coordination ensured that our aircraft departure would be conducted with proper security procedures to minimize exposure to potential threats during the vulnerable takeoff phase. Sarah's group provided perimeter security while we completed final preparations, and they had contingency plans for suppressing any organized attacks that might occur during our departure operations. The coordination between our groups demonstrated how professional training and systematic approaches could enable effective cooperation even between strangers in crisis situations. The loading procedures for our overweight aircraft required precise attention to weight distribution and securing all equipment to prevent shifts during flight that could affect aircraft control. I applied the same systematic approach I used for commercial aircraft loading, ensuring that every item was properly secured and positioned to maintain proper center of gravity throughout the flight. Emma's safety restraints required special attention because standard aircraft seats weren't designed for someone her size. Sarah provided detailed briefings about potential threats we might encounter during flight, including military aircraft that were conducting interdiction operations, and infected groups that had learned to use signal devices to attract aircraft toward ground-based attacks. Her experience with recent evacuation flights provided crucial intelligence about safe routes and landing procedures that would minimize our exposure to these evolving threats. The tactical environment was becoming more complex as both military and infected populations adapted their strategies. The engine start procedures for the Cessna required careful attention to proper techniques for an aircraft that hadn't been operated regularly. I used my mechanical knowledge to ensure that all systems were functioning correctly before attempting takeoff, because mechanical failures during departure would be catastrophic, with no suitable emergency landing areas nearby. The engine responded well to startup procedures, and all flight instruments showed normal indications despite the aircraft's age and maintenance history. David helped Emma into the aircraft and ensured that she was properly secured with safety restraints that would protect her during what might be a challenging takeoff and flight. Her calm demeanor continued to impress me, and her ability to follow complex instructions precisely made her easier to manage than some adult passengers I had flown. David's positioning allowed him to provide additional protection while maintaining proper weight distribution for flight operations. Margaret and Robert took their assigned positions in the aircraft, with Margaret serving as my co-pilot despite having no aviation experience. Her strategic thinking abilities and calm demeanor under pressure made her the best choice for assisting with navigation and communication tasks during flight. Robert managed our equipment and supplies, ensuring that everything was secured properly for the dynamic forces of takeoff and flight operations. The pre-takeoff checklist required modifications for our overweight condition and challenging departure circumstances. I applied short-field takeoff techniques learned during military training, using maximum available runway distance and optimal aircraft configuration to achieve safe flight operations despite our weight limitations. The aircraft performance calculations showed marginal but acceptable safety margins for our departure, assuming proper technique and favorable weather conditions. Sarah provided final weather information and navigation guidance based on her recent flight experience in the regional area. Visibility conditions were acceptable for visual flight operations, and wind patterns would be favorable for our planned route toward rural Wyoming. However, she warned about possible military aircraft activity that could complicate our navigation and create additional safety concerns during flight. The military was conducting interdiction operations to prevent the spread of infected populations, but their rules of engagement were unclear and potentially dangerous for civilian aircraft. The takeoff roll required precise control inputs and careful monitoring of aircraft performance as we accelerated down the runway. The Cessna responded sluggishly due to our excessive weight, but engine power was adequate, and all systems functioned normally during the critical departure phase. I used every available foot of runway distance before lifting off, applying maximum performance techniques to achieve safe flight operations. The aircraft became airborne with minimal margin for error, but all performance parameters remained within acceptable limits. Once airborne, the aircraft handled acceptably despite being loaded beyond normal weight limits. I maintained precise airspeed control and climb performance to ensure that we remained within safe flight parameters while gaining altitude and distance from the Denver area. The view from above revealed the full scope of the catastrophe that had engulfed the city, with fires burning in multiple areas and clear evidence of systematic infrastructure breakdown throughout the metropolitan region. The extent of the destruction was far greater than what we had observed from ground level. Navigation toward rural Wyoming required careful attention to fuel consumption and aircraft performance, while avoiding areas where military aircraft activity might create safety concerns. I use pilotage and dead reckoning techniques rather than relying on electronic navigation systems that might not be functioning reliably. Robert's GPS coordinates provided checkpoints for navigation, but visual, landmark identification was essential for accurate navigation in the deteriorating technological environment. The flight provided an aerial perspective on the crisis that confirmed our strategic assessment about population density affecting contamination spread. Rural areas showed much less evidence of chaos and destruction, while cities and towns exhibited clear signs of systematic breakdown. This observation validated our decision to seek safety in sparsely populated mountainous regions, where infected populations would be less concentrated and where natural barriers might provide additional protection from expanding threats. Margaret monitored radio communications during flight and discovered fragmentary transmissions from other survivor groups who were establishing communities in remote areas. These communications suggested that organized resistance and recovery efforts were beginning to develop, though coordination was limited by communication system failures. The information provided hope that we would find established support networks once we reached our destination, and that our survival efforts were part of a larger pattern of organized response to the crisis. Emma handled the flight experience remarkably well, showing curiosity about aviation operations while maintaining the calm discipline that had characterized her behavior throughout our survival ordeal. David's stress levels decreased significantly once we were airborne and moving toward safety, though he remained vigilant about potential threats and challenges that might await us after landing. The psychological relief of escaping Denver was evident in everyone's demeanor, though we understood that reaching rural Wyoming was only the beginning of our long-term survival challenges. Our fuel consumption calculations indicated that we had sufficient range to reach the rural Wyoming airstrip that Robert had identified as our primary destination. The aircraft's mechanical systems continued functioning normally despite the demanding operational conditions, and weather remained favorable for continued flight operations. However, I maintained awareness of alternative landing sites in case circumstances required changes to our flight plan, and I monitored engine performance constantly for any signs of mechanical problems that could force an emergency landing. The radio communications we monitored during flight included references to my sister Maya's work area in Yellowstone National Park, where some survivor groups had apparently established contact with Park Service personnel. This information suggested that Maya might be safe and potentially involved in organized survival efforts, which provided additional motivation for continuing toward the northwestern Wyoming region. The park's remote location and natural resources could provide an ideal base for long-term survival operations. As we approached our planned landing site, I conducted the same systematic approach procedures I used for commercial aircraft operations, despite the challenging circumstances and unfamiliar airport. The rural airstrip appeared to be uncontrolled and unoccupied, which provided both advantages and challenges for our arrival and subsequent operations. I used standard traffic pattern procedures while remaining alert for potential threats or obstacles that might not be visible until final. Approach. The landing approach required careful attention to aircraft performance and runway conditions at an unfamiliar airport with no support services or emergency equipment. I applied all of my flight training and experience to ensure a safe arrival, despite the challenging operational circumstances. The Cessna touched down smoothly and rolled to a stop on the gravel runway, marking the successful completion of our evacuation from Denver and the beginning of whatever challenges awaited us. In rural Wyoming, our 72-hour survival ordeal had tested every aspect of our teamwork, leadership, and individual capabilities while teaching us lessons about crisis management that no training program could have provided. The systematic approaches we had learned from aviation, military, medical, and security backgrounds proved essential for surviving circumstances that none of us had ever imagined facing. As we secured the aircraft and began planning our next phase of survival, I reflected on how professional training and disciplined teamwork had enabled us to overcome seemingly impossible challenges through careful planning, decisive action, and mutual support during the most dangerous crisis any of us had ever experienced.